Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. Australia is one of the world's most successful multicultural nations. From convict transportations and free settlers from England, Scotland and Ireland in the 18th and early 19th centuries, through to European migrants in the 1940s and 50s, displaced people, Vietnamese in the 70s, Chinese in the 80s, and the more recent phenomenon of Indian migration, Australia is a melting pot of religions, traditions and cultures. Strategic concerns during the Second World War led to bipartisan agreement that Australia would need a much bigger population than natural increases could deliver. We would need to populate or perish. To talk about the story of post-war Australian immigrants is Peter Brune, one of Australia's leading military historians. Welcome to Afternoon Light, Peter.
My pleasure.
Thank you for joining me from Adelaide, which is recovering from a pretty intense heat wave. So I hope you're cooling down now. Tell me, Peter, what was the situation when it came to migration to Australia prior to World War II?
I think there are two very critical points that came to light, to my amazement, actually during the war. The first problem was that we had a giant scare when the Japanese got as far as Papua New Guinea and were trying to capture Port Moresby. So one of the reasons was a strategic view that we had to grow our population in order to defend ourselves. But then the really critical issue was the fact that right through the Western world, a whole generation had gone through the Great Depression and all of the suffering that entailed, but then they'd gone through the most horrific war in history, and rather than just winning the war, they wanted a better society after the war. And that included such things as improved transportation, better housing, social services, irrigation, power, and these things could not be accomplished without a growth in population. And the thing that just amazed me was that the Labor government, as early as 1942, was planning reconstruction while the Japanese were busy fighting us in New Guinea. And they consulted the academics around the country, and eventually they woke up to the fact that we would need a population increase of about 140,000 a year. Now, the problem was that natural means were going to furnish 70,000. So we had to have 70,000 immigrants a year, starting from about 46, 47. And the fascinating thing about that is that, in a sense, the politicians coerced, if you want to use the word, the Australian population into gradually realising that Britain wasn't going to furnish 70,000 a year. It had a tremendous shortage of shipping. Many British people didn't want to come here. And so the academics were warning the government that we might be very smart in taking refugees, displaced persons from Europe.
Why didn't Britons particularly want to come to Australia, though, by the 1940s? Was it because they thought the economic conditions were no good, it was too far away? I mean, Britain after the war or during the war must have been a pretty tough place to live. You'd have thought they would want to get out of there as soon as they could.
We did get quite a number of British immigrants, but we were never going to get enough. And as I've just said, with the ambitions of an improved society, the British had what was called the Beveridge Report. And they identified the very same aspirations amongst the British people as we had in Australia. In other words, improved social services, education. Beveridge came up with the idea that every worker would have 1 shilling taken out of their pay every week for a superannuation retirement fund. So, yes, we did have British immigrants, but we were never going to get enough of them.
So the government in Australia was convinced that the British migration wouldn't supply the requisite 70,000 needed to populate the country for our economic post-war reconstruction, but also for our security needs. So how did the government go about identifying where to find these migrants?
Well, there are a number of academics pointing to the fact that as early, once again, as 1942-3, they were saying that war-ravaged Europe were going to have the opportunity to give us an enormous number of refugees or immigrants. And the startling organisation that I think was just brilliant was the IRO, the International Refugee Organisation, and its task was to examine, provide shelter, food for around about 7 million refugees that were in Western Europe. And Chifley, who was Prime Minister at the time, found out that this great number of displaced persons were sitting in Europe and advised Arthur Calwell, who was the Minister of Immigration, to go on a fact-finding mission, which he did in 46, or it might have been 47. And Calwell met representatives of the IRO in London, and they came up with a pretty attractive plan. They had already screened a lot of these displaced persons, and they decided that they would give countries like Australia, Canada, they would provide the shipping. Now, there was an enormous shortage of shipping. As you would know, the Germans managed to sink an enormous amount of shipping during the Atlantic War. And so the IRO were providing more or less free shipping, and Calwell then made a tour of some of the DP camps and put in a system whereby screening officers were recruited. Many of them were young veterans of the RAAF, and I think the thing that startled me was the fact that this had not been done before. This was totally new ground. For example, if you were standing up in front of me at a desk in a displaced persons camp in Europe, there'd be every chance that you'd have the clothes you were wearing, maybe a very small suitcase, and more than likely you wouldn't have much, if any, paperwork. And my job was to assess you to see whether we could take you to Australia. However free the shipping was, the screening process was really quite an enormous task and a difficult one.
And what sort of people were they looking for, Peter, when they were screening these refugees in Western Europe?
They were looking for young people, basically anywhere between 18 and, say, 35 or 40. They needed to be fit. Tuberculosis was the big scare at the time. So they had x-rays, they had needles. They didn't worry at all about skills. That's one of the fascinating things about the scheme. The deal was that if I took you as a young lady to Australia, you would have to work anywhere I sent you for a period of 2 years. And then you were free to do what you wanted to do, go where you wanted to go. But it was a very clever scheme in the sense, for example, our railways were underdeveloped. We had enormous challenges there, the timber industry, things like the Snowy River scheme, cane cutting in Queensland, domestic women required for Melbourne, Sydney, Adelaide, factories. And so wherever the need was, we placed those people. It sounds a bit harsh, but it was very, very pragmatic and successful.
Now, Arthur Calwell, who of course becomes opposition leader later on, but as Australia's first ever immigration minister, he certainly was strongly committed to the White Australia policy. And in some of his speeches, you read quite sort of racist language towards non-British and non-white migrants. How was he even personally overcome these concerns and particularly able to convince his Labor supporters who'd traditionally been very concerned about the impacts of importing foreign labour into Australia for the impact it might have on wages and conditions and the like?
The fascinating thing really, I believe, is that when we look at the White Australia policy now in 2024, obviously we're appalled. But it's very interesting to note that Canada had exactly the same policy. The other point that's worth remembering is it was a very, very different Asia and Southeast Asia than it is now. For example, Singapore and Malaysia weren't Singapore and Malaysia. That was British Malaya. Indonesia wasn't Indonesia. It was the Dutch East Indies. Indochina was French. And so the idea that you would be recruiting people from that area, one, obviously you're right, it was racist. But as I said, the Canadians were exactly the same. But two, how do you set up a system? It was colonial Asia. And Caldwell wasn't out there by himself with that attitude. All parts of the political system in Australia at that stage were very much white Australia. But I think the thing that stands out about the whole deal, probably in contrast to immigration as we speak, is that it was terribly bipartisan, and that is a tremendous salute to both political parties at the time. Arthur Caldwell was pretty well fanatical about the idea of populating our country with Europeans, admittedly. Harold Holt merely took over Caldwell's work and followed it through just as energetically, just as diligently. And I think the whole thing worked because the Chifley government, and for that matter, the Menzies government, when it came to power, was able to, I wouldn't use the word coerce, work with the unions. The unions early in the piece, before the scheme started, were concerned that they would undercut wages, that they would undercut conditions, and that the whole thing might not work. Where in actual fact, these immigrants stimulated the economy, made the economy grow. And the startling thing to my way of thinking is, when you look back on it, it's the most stirring political, social, and above all, economic experiment in Australian history, the sheer magnitude of it. And it worked so brilliantly because it was totally bipartisan. Both Labor and Liberal governments had the same focus, the same energy, and put the work in. It was a remarkable experiment that we bear the fruits of today.
I mean, it really was an experiment across economics, society and politics, and it has forevermore changed Australia's cultural composition. But was there any precedent for this? I mean, this would have been incredibly brave of the Chifley and then, of course, the Menzies government in implementing this post-war migration program.
There had been a fairly sturdy intake of Italians in particular in the 20s, I believe, but not on this scale. And to me, the really incredible thing about it was the simple idea that if you take young, healthy people and you give them those 2 years to inject their energies into our labour, then we were really going to reap some awards. The Snowy River scheme is arguably a shining example of that. The railway system, the metric tonnes, the incredible increase in timber, the cane cutters in Queensland, to say nothing of the people that came to the cities and filled necessary jobs. And I think the extraordinary thing about it is we didn't have a textbook. We didn't have guidelines. This was a totally new experience in terms of choosing these people, putting them on ships. There was an unbelievable shortage of housing in Australia after the war. So how do you house these people and how do you put them off into these desired jobs around Australia? And the answer was simple. You use army camps. For example, in South Australia, you had Woodside Army Camp in the Adelaide Hills. In Perth, you had Northern Army Camp. You had Bonegilla. And the other good thing about concentrating those people in the camps very briefly was that the Department of Labour and Industry could then have them in mass and then allot them jobs. It was very, very efficient. It was only later in the late 50s, 60s, where I think one of our major flaws was, and the Italian and Greek communities in part resent that to this day, in that we gave all of these displaced persons a free passage to Australia. We found them jobs, whereas the Italians and the Greeks had to sponsor each other. I suspect one of the major flaws in the system was that on occasions, they separated families. For example, there was a Ukrainian couple wonderful couple. They were told that the husband could come to Australia and 11 months later, his wife could come. And by the way, as an interesting sideline, the Ukrainian couple met in a displaced persons camp, got married, and the bride's wedding dress was made from an American parachute.
Wow.
And the extraordinary thing is, I think the unfair part of it was that he had to work here in Queensland for 11 months before she could come. So I think the splitting of families, it wasn't widespread, but it wasn't a good part of the program for obvious reasons.
No. Tell me about the beautiful bolts, because this is a really interesting example of the kind of propaganda that the government had to engage in to sell these new migrants, post-war new migrants, to the Australian public.
It does fascinate me. I quoted a gentleman, I suspect he came from Melbourne, Mr. Stafford, worked for the Immigration Department for years, quoted him in the book as saying, well, he picked the Balts first, as they called them, the Baltic people, because they were the most like us. And he actually quoted, he said, if you passed one in Collins Street, Melbourne, or North Terrace, Adelaide, you wouldn't give them a second look. And I thought, okay, I get it. But for the life of me, I can't see the difference between a Ukrainian, a Baltic person, and a Pole if they walk past you in Collins Street or North Terrace.
Yeah, but it's interesting, the photos that were published by the newspapers when these first group, I think of 800 or so displaced people from Baltic countries came to Australia, and they're blue-eyed, blonde, red-haired. They're standing there with Corwell looking, they're actually in traditional dress. They're not necessarily dressed in clothes that you might have worn in Australia in the 1940s, but they look as attractive as you would expect, and they're young and look like a prospective wife or husband, a good worker, that sort of thing.
Do you know two things that I believe the book does that I haven't seen much done on at all? The first thing is the simple fact, and it's probably the military historian in me, we didn't fight in Central and Eastern Europe. We fought in Greece, yes, but we didn't fight in Central and Eastern Europe. So one of the things I was very, very keen to accomplish with the book is to pick the 13 or 14 countries from Eastern and Central Europe who sent us the most immigrants, and then get one sample of each nationality. And I suppose if you were lazy, you could say, okay, I live in Adelaide, I'll get all 14 stories in Adelaide. But I wanted to spread the stories around Australia. And so there's 2 or 3 Queensland interviews, there's New South Wales, there's Victoria, there's Western Australia. I left South Australia till last just as well because COVID came. And I thought, what I don't have, I'll get here in Adelaide. And so the idea was that I wanted the sample to be spread around the country. Therefore, each person would have a different story, a local story, as well as the big picture story. And to appreciate these people, to me, it was critical that we understood their war story, not in clinical military history detail, but a bit of a run through of what had happened to their country at the start of the war and then their experience. To really appreciate these people, it is heartrending to see what they've gone through. Some of them 15-year-old forced labourers. One young girl from the Ukraine, Germans knocked on the door, said to the parents, okay, you have to supply one of your children for work in Germany or we'll take the husband. So can you imagine, at 15 years of age, she's put in a farm in Germany to work 7 days a week for the rest of the war. And so, to me, telling their war story gave a context. And then the second thing I wanted to do was to then tell their story of how they established themselves here and then how they look back on the experience. And those revelations, I believe, are absolutely fascinating.
And did they differ in terms of their experiences around the country? Did you find that someone in Queensland might have had a better or worse experience than someone, say, in South Australia or New South Wales?
There's some incredible insights. One of the things that was almost universal, I asked them, how did you find Australia and Australians? And of course, some of them said, well, I got the cold shoulder on trams or buses or society for a while. We'll get to assimilation in a second, which I think is a keynote of the book. The thing that struck them right between the eyes was egalitarian Australia. For example, the Ukrainian cane cutter said he just loved the idea that he could walk into a pub and call the boss by his first name and have a beer with him, whereas European culture was very structured and you tended to know your socio-economic place in the world. So they loved that. I suppose the old Australian adage, give someone a go, and they felt that and they loved it. They thought our food was a little bit different. They thought Bonagila, for example, many of them went through Bonagila and they couldn't get over. Their exact words were, I had mutton, and then I had mutton, and it was very fattening. But then a couple of them went off fishing in the weir near Bonagila. Some of them started buying outside stuff. But do you know something that fascinated me? Harold Holt did a radio broadcast in Canberra somewhere around 52. And the object of the broadcast was assimilation. And so he asked Albert Monk, who was the leader of the ACTU at that stage, and he asked a sociologist and so on. He had 4 speakers. And this intrigued me. Governments can plan, they can make newsreels, they can have the Good Neighbour Council, they can have newspaper advertisements. But the whole idea of assimilation, to me, is a gradual process that is untouchable. It will happen whether anyone likes it or not. And so Albert Monk, for example, said, these people should stop talking their language. They mustn't have newspapers in their language. They shouldn't have ethnic clubs. They should mix with Australians. Now, what this book shows is that how could one ever blame Poles, for example, forming a Polish club? It was where they could converse with people of their own creed. It's where they could enjoy their food, their customs, their dances and so on and so forth. And for that matter, send their kids to Polish school on a Saturday morning or whenever. But the fascinating thing, if you look at so-called ethnic clubs now, you'll notice that the Lithuanian club, for example, in Sydney, has sold and downsized because when this first generation came as displaced persons, the second generation, when they get here, the second generation, yes, they go to the ethnic clubs, they go to the ethnic schools, but it starts to water down. And if you look at ethnic clubs now, they don't have anything like the membership they had all those years ago because their children and children's children, they're proud of their heritage, of course. They go to main events at the Polish club or the Lithuanian club, but they don't go as often because they've assimilated.
Yes.
And the other fascinating thing is, as the German interviewee said, we assimilated you too. We exposed you to our food, to our cosmopolitan lifestyle, to a lot of our values. And then, of course, you get into marriage. And that creates, who would walk around this lovely country of ours now and call a Greek heritage person a wog? Who would walk up to an Italian heritage person today and say, Dago? Those words are gone. They were racist, they were ignorant. They're just Australians now. And to that extent, the experiment that was conducted in the 40s and 50s and 60s is just extraordinary.
It really was extraordinary. And what is really interesting is these different stories you've collected, Peter. And of course, there were Ukrainians, there were Poles, there were people from the Baltic states, but there were also Germans with complicated pasts, weren't there? I mean, what was the reception, Peter, to German migrants coming to Australia Australia had been fighting a war against Germany. Presumably there were some residual concerns and hatreds against the former enemy.
I think there are a couple of interesting points with that. Also applied to the Italians. We'd fought against them in North Africa. The really interesting thing is, initially, we didn't have any Germans. And Mark Ahrens has written a fantastic book about Nazi collaborators that managed to get into Australia. That was partly due to the fact that our screening system was complicated. As I've said, we had no experience to go on. But the other interesting thing is, from around about 51, we made a deal with the West German government, and it was decided that we'd even have ex-SS people, provided they were under a certain rank. But to answer your question, I think maybe because we'd already had a reasonably strong history of Germans coming to our country in the 1800s, particularly in South Australia. And I think it gets back to the old adage, give someone a go. We needed them as much as they needed a new life. And I think some people at the time tended to think we'd done these people such a wonderful favour. They helped build our post-war prosperity. They've added so much to our culture. And, it's incredibly ironic, and I love the story of Celestino Foti, who was in the Italian army, captured by the Australians in Tobruk, sent to Cowra, prisoner of war camp in New South Wales, woke up to the fact that the future was Australia, and the Foti family had been pyrotechnicians for a couple of centuries on a small scale. And he said to his wife, I think the future's in Australia. Now, this is where it was tough. That poor man had to come to Australia, be sponsored by Italian friends in Sydney, leave his wife and children, and then he worked and brought his son out, and then they both worked very hard and brought mum and the other two kids out. And particularly for someone like me who's a baby boomer, all of your baby boomer listeners would probably fondly remember Guy Fawkes Night, where we had our skyrockets and squibs and bonfires and all of that stuff. And the Vulcan Firework Company in Sydney made all of those crackers. Foti started out as a prisoner of war in Australia and ended up buying out the Vulcan Firework Company. Oh, wow. And all of those magnificent fireworks we see on Sydney Harbour and the bridge every New Year is Foti International Fireworks.
That's amazing. Amazing story.
Not a bad effort, is it?
Yeah.
And then they lectured us. His wife opened the first espresso coffee lounge in Campbelltown, Sydney, and the first customer came in and said, I'll have a cup of your chino. And one of the waitresses asked her whether the longer spaghetti grew on bigger trees. So we were learning too.
Absolutely. But do you think, Peter, that there were many serious war criminals who were allowed to come in to Australia through the period of the 50s?
Yeah, there's no doubt that a number of them got in. They got in because, if you were a German at the end of the Second World War, the Americans captured something like 20 million official records. You could track a German down very, very easily. The catch was, and this was another revelation for me, in a nutshell, there was an SS formation called Einsatzgruppen, and there were 4 battalions of roughly 1,000 men each. And as the German army captured Operation Barbarossa when they invaded the Soviet Union, the Einsatzgruppen would come in and slaughter Jews, political commissars, undesirables through their eyes. But they couldn't do that job themselves. There were a lot of Nazi collaborators who did a lot of the dirty work with them and for them. Some of those collaborators went into Germany, Austria and Italy as the Russians came forward towards the end of the war. And then, as I mentioned earlier, if one of those collaborators was standing up in front of you and I and we were screening them to see whether we'd let them in, it would be very, very hard to prove that they had done anything wrong. The problem came, and this is the sad story, some of these people got on the ships and were coming out, and they were exposed by other people who had seen some of their acts. Or in the case of some of the SS blokes who had, an SS soldier had his blood group and number in his left armpit tattooed. And they saw some of these people washing themselves on the ship and saw the tattoos. One or two even bragged about what they'd done, and yet we didn't kick them out. And I suspect there's two reasons. One is that Cornwall didn't want adverse publicity about the immigration scheme. And the other thing that comes out in David Horner's history of ASIO is that Western intelligence believed that some of these people might be useful in intelligence work. And the really ridiculous thing is they weren't. We thought they might be, but they weren't. And so to answer your question, yes, there were a number of Nazi collaborators that came into Australia.
I wonder if you could talk, Peter, about how the Australian government and the community welcomed these new migrants. There's some quite interesting bodies that were set up. I think you mentioned the Good Neighbour movement before, but these annual Australian citizenship conventions, the fact that Australian citizenship as a status distinct from British was even created in 1948. So there's this sort of sense of you have a process to go through to become an Australian, but we're also going to now show how these new Australians are going to become Australian too through these processes. And I'd wonder if you could talk about those things in more detail and whether they were effective or not.
As we've said, it was a new venture treading totally unfamiliar ground. One good example is, with the best of intentions, the government set up social workers to try and help these people. But of course, the problem was, and once again I was amazed, social work as an academic course in universities had only been going for a while. And so the social workers themselves, it wasn't a profession at that time that had a lot of experience, a lot of know-how. Most of the social workers were women, and they did a fantastic job. But one of the problems you ran into was, one, shortage of staff. Two, how do you get a social worker, if you've only got a limited number of them, to Innisfail in Queensland to help cane cutters? How do you get them off to remote parts of Australia where they're working on the railways? And one of the biggest challenges the social workers had was the idea that, once again, they sometimes split families. They would let the wife and children stay perhaps at Bonagila while the husband went off doing his job. And then often it was the poor old social workers that had to deal with those multitude of problems. Another problem they had was the obvious language barrier. And so they tried rather hard to teach them English in places like Bonagila or Woodside with limited success. In fact, my German interviewee said that his English teacher at Bonagila had said, I'm not worried about teaching you English. I want to teach you about the Australian culture, because as soon as you get out there and rub shoulders with them, you'll pick up English. So I thought that was a fascinating approach. But Good Neighbour Council, I think in hindsight, its only flaw was that it wanted to get hold of these people and turn them into instant Australians instead of coming to terms and understanding their culture and helping them melt with us. It was a one-way street with the very best of intentions. And then you've got another problem, and that was the simple one that some of these people weren't in any hurry to be naturalised, because some of them were sitting back and looking, and this applied to a lot of people that went to Canada and the US and Britain. The theory was, and I get it, they thought that there would be a final confrontation between the Soviets and the Western Allies, And when the dust settled and their freedom came back, they'd go home. Well, as we know, that didn't happen until 1990. Other people wanted to get as far away from Europe as they could possibly get, and that was Australia. And also, a lot of them believed that our climate would be attractive. Other than our climate and our geographical isolation, a lot of them didn't know the first thing about Australia. But another reason they chose Australia was that our processing was quicker than many of the other countries. In other words, if they applied for Canada, the United States, England and Australia, Australia tended to answer positively first, and I suspect that was because it was a way of gleaning the good stuff quickly.
How important do you think it was that the 1950s ended up being such a period of prosperity for Australia? You know, there was extremely low unemployment. Wages were actually very good despite the sort of influxes of migrants. The wages stayed pretty strong and it was good times really for all. That presumably was incredibly important for the positive reception the migrants were getting.
Oh, no doubt. And the post-war reconstruction and that massive intake of immigrants facilitated those programs, facilitated the economy. We were very, very fortunate. And the other thing that the migrants, to the last man and woman I interviewed, they all said what they loved about Australia was that if you worked hard, you could save and you could build a house. The other fascinating thing I found, if you and I wanted to put a pergola up in our backyard now, there's quite a deal of paperwork with local councils. In those days, a couple just bought a block of land. And one of my favourite stories is the Ukrainian woman who was heavily pregnant at the time decided she would be the builder's labourer. She walked to her husband and said, all you've got to do is lay the bricks in the corners. And then I've seen these men do it. They put a string from one corner to the other, and then they just build the wall. So if you had $1 for everyone who just virtually built their own house or got their mates in, no council approval, no carrying on, no red tape, they built their homes, and there was this tremendous feeling of accomplishment that they could save, they could work hard, and they could get ahead.
Yeah. And do you think that meant they were admired by the Australians around them?
Well, I think you're dead right. Many admired and some resented it. They didn't tend to go to the pub every night, and not that every Australian did either, but there were some Australians that resented the fact that these people came with nothing and got ahead so quickly. And, of course, this comes back to their war story. If you're a forced labourer in Germany and you're underfed, you've got a horrible existence, and you come to a new land where if you work, you earn darn good money, you can save, you can get ahead. They had the motivation. They were finally in their lives in a position where they would be rewarded for hard work, and by Joe's, they did just that, hard work.
I mean, it's a great story, Peter. Did they get involved in politics much, the new migrants, or did they steer clear of it?
From what I can gather, their political views tended to be pretty well to the right.
Yes.
Pretty conservative, very, very anti-communist for obvious reasons. No, I don't think they got actively involved in politics other than being able to vote once they had their citizenship. But I think the other really interesting thing about them is that I asked all of them towards the end of their interview, did you go back to the old country? Many of them had, and the fascinating answer that came out of nearly all of them was they felt strangers in their own former country. Yeah. A Serbian woman I interviewed, lovely woman, went back to Serbia, and the people said to her, you speak in the old way. Yeah. You follow the old customs. So in a crazy sort of way, they didn't belong in their original country, and some of them were very critical of the old land. The Poles, for example, the Polish interviews, they all said, under communism, they'll take a couple of generations to get their oomph back, to get their motivation. They've lost it. And that was a fairly common reaction. Yes, they love to get home to see family members. Yes, they love to go to the old country. But there was a sense of not totally belonging anymore. Nearly all of them would use the term Polish Australian, Serbian Australian, Croatian Australian. In other words, they hadn't forgotten the past, but they were very appreciative and happy with the future.
I mean, you write about cultural fossilization, that sort of idea that you come out in the late 40s, 50s as a Serbian or a Pole or whatever, and you are preserving your culture at a point in time in a way rather than keeping up with how Serbia is changing or Poland is changing.
Probably the most poignant thing that was said to me was by my Italian interview in Sydney. He said, we're more Italian than the Italians.
Yeah.
And he actually believed that the old values of family, respect, the old institutions were better than the Italy he went back and visited. And so, as you say, it is a cultural fossilization which in time wore out because the dear people passed on, but also as their children come along and their children come along. I spoke to a Polish man who's in his early 40s, just in passing, and I said, do you go to the Polish club? This is here in Adelaide. And he said, no, that's for the old people. So he's about as Australian as you're going to get, isn't he?
Yeah. I wonder if you could, on a final note, Peter, reflect on that change from this sort of policy of assimilation we had in the late 40s, 50s, through to what we see in the 60s of more really integration into Australian society, that you could keep a bit of your heritage and identity that you've brought from wherever you've come from, but you just needed to integrate, not go so far as to assimilate, but integrate. Was that a sort of I guess it represented Australians after 10, 20 years getting used to new Australians in their midst in great numbers, and it was okay, things hadn't gone badly, in fact they've gone very well, and maybe a maturity in Australian society about migration?
I think bureaucrats are very, very clever at coming up with terms and policies. So you have terms like New Australian, REFO. You have terms such as assimilation, integration. But as I've said, there's an irreversible process that occurs over a couple of generations where people mix, there's intermarriage. There are children born in Australia that don't identify as closely with the old country as their original parents. And I think they change us as well as we change them. I mean, a fairly basic example. When I was a young boy, my parents, as a special treat, used to take my sisters and I into a street in Adelaide called Guja Street. And there was a cafe there called the Guja Cafe. And their idea of shouting us tea, which was a real treat, was a mixed grill, a sausage, a chop, a piece of steak, a bit of chopped lettuce, tomato. If you walk down Guja Street, Adelaide now, you'll find something over 30 restaurants from 30 different countries. Food is the obvious one, but we are more cosmopolitan. The tremendous advances in communication. Don't forget, the generation that fought the Second World War, the Australian generation, many people in Melbourne would never have been to Adelaide. Too far. Imagine thinking if you were a normal middle-class, lower middle-class working person, what it would cost you to get to Europe. You'd have to go 4 weeks in a ship. It would be beyond your means. Young people now can come straight out of high school. They can work as a glassy or a waitress in a cafe. Within a year, they can save the money and they can be in London in 24 hours. They can backpack around Europe. We were a much, much more insular society in 1946 to 65. And I think that whole immigration program from 46-7 through to 66 is still the most remarkable leap forward this country has seen.
Well, I think you're right, Peter. We live with the impacts of it very much to this day, and I think makes us just such a unique and, I think, wonderful country to rival any other across the world. But Peter, thank you very much for giving Australia this book, and of course the discussion today. I've found it absolutely fascinating.
It's been my pleasure, Georgina, and best wishes to your listeners.
Thank you. That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.